Great, and hopefully you've got fresh bottles of water and cups and things if you need them. Great. Okay. Well, thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. Just to kick us off, the government has obviously confirmed that it's not bringing forward the employment bill, which it had previously indicated it would do. But they have noted in correspondence to the committee that they believe through the support of private members' bills and updates to guidance that they're delivering on a number of the aspects you might have seen in the employment rights bill. Could you just set out for the committee what you think is still to do on the government's to-do list, noting its support for certain private members' bills and updates to guidance? And in the normal way, I'll go from left to right. So Professor Ewing first, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Well, I think the context originally was the Taylor review. I'm not sure if that's still where the committee is, given all that has happened since then, because there have been a number of seismic developments, I think, which affect the question of employment rights. One, of course, is Brexit, another is the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, another is COVID, and another is austerity. So I think we moved a long way since Taylor. But, I mean, within that framework, I think there are issues, having regard to current developments as well as developments at the time of Taylor. There are issues around employment status, which I think need to be resolved. There are issues around fire and rehire, which I think have yet to be satisfactorily addressed. There are issues around fire and replace, which we saw at P&O. There are issues about the enforcement of labour standards. And then I think beyond that, there is the question I think that people don't want to ask, which is the effect of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement on our domestic employment rights. In a sense, we can't go back to the world as it was before the 1st of January 1973, when we joined the European Economic Community. We have inherited obligations in the agreement to which we must give effect, and obligations from EU membership which we must retain as a result of the agreement. So there's a legal framework there which I don't see being spoken about very much, but which I think we need fully to address.
Thank you. And Kate Durden?
Thank you. I think we've laid out very clearly, I guess, the economic landscape and the changes since the Taylor Review, which are important to consider. But the world of work is continuing to change. Increasingly, people are switching jobs, careers and sectors, new technologies facilitating such a growth. And I think what the Taylor Review did really well was open that debate about what good work is and what it looks like, and set an aspiration for fair, decent and good quality work. At that point, I think it could be fair to say that the government and policymakers and the media perhaps became too fixated with the gig economy and the extent of the gig economy, and sort of it does represent quite a small part of the workforce. But those changes in technology do require a much broader view of work, and I don't think in that respect the Taylor Review went far enough. Now I think we're seeing a much more blended labour market, all ways of working, an increase in one form of working to another, from traditional to side hustles and non-traditional employment. So I think, a key question for us is how we make those forms of work and this form of work for everyone in a fair, meaningful and decent way, and make, crucially, innovation work for workers. New technology, as I mentioned, is very much enabling those ways of work and those new business models, and non-traditional work is growing. But I think a key problem we've alluded to is that our system of workers' rights isn't adapting from freelancers to platform-based work. So, how do we then build on traditional employment, I suppose, as a basis of that secure foundation, and use it as a broader concept and focus on good work for all, irrespective of employment status, which does still very much need reviewing. And for all workers who do engage with non-traditional work, that they also feel empowered in deciding how and when they want to engage in that work is obviously crucial for us as a union, and how we rebalance that power. But also a key part to it is still benefiting from the flexibility, the ways of working that people are choosing to do and enjoy, and sort of thriving on that independence while also having those better protections and rights at work, from sick pay, basic rate of pay to better rights. So we really want to see our system of workers' rights, adapting because at the moment I think it's fair to say that it's creating problems for those individuals, but also a lot of uncertainty for businesses in limiting their flexibility too. So we need to get ahead of the change. I think still all those years on from the Taylor Review, and we cannot accept a race to the bottom on wages and standards because it is very much economically damaging, and we need to see a modernisation of our legal frameworks that are meant to be supporting workers' rights and don't encourage lower standards and wages. And I think looking forwards, there are lots of innovative and creative ways that we could explore to make work fairer, irrespective of employment status I've mentioned.
Thank you. And Philippa Charles, it sounds like there's a lot to do still in the employment bill that hasn't arrived. Do you agree, presumably?
Absolutely, I do agree with everything that's been said so far. But also, I just want to give a bit of an example of how the world of work has changed, particularly in the sector where BEIS operates, which is the creative industries. So, for example, in film and TV, the balance between employees and the freelance workforce has shifted very much towards the freelance workforce. So when we use the term freelancers in that respect, I'm really talking about a range of different engagement patterns. So, for example, short-term PAYE employees who, as was mentioned earlier, they're treated as employees but don't have the opportunity to get the benefits that go along with that because of the short-term project nature of film and TV. Sole traders and obviously people who operate through personal service companies. And I don't think our current framework addresses all of the different types of patterns of working in the economy. So I think there is much more to do, and some of it's been mentioned already in terms of how we provide a framework for freelance workers that supports them in terms of their family life and future plans.
The government suggested that it's delivered on its obligation of putting together a good work plan by supporting a number of P&Bs, updated guidance, making a bit of progress in those areas. Beyond the legislation, do we really have a well-defined good work plan or not?
I don't think we do. No, I think we look at the workforce in very much of a binary basis, and actually we need to recognise that across the economy there are all sorts of different patterns of engagement and employment, and we need to actually address a plan that is fit for purpose for all of those types of workers.
Okay. Andy MacDonald, please.
Thanks, Chair. Could I just address the issue of flexibility in working arrangements? Because as we've heard, obviously we were expecting an employment bill, had bits and bats coming through. The government's made an announcement, and we heard from the Secretary of State, I think it was just last month, that it's important to recognise, he said, that what we have said is that people should be able to ask the question. We are trying to set out the ground rules, but we are not forcing the answer. What are your thoughts on the government's flexible working arrangements? Philippa, do you want to start with that?
Sorry, what's
your thoughts on the government's announcement around flexible working arrangements, the right to request?
Yeah, well, true flexibility needs to be available to everyone in the economy, and needs to address other issues rather than just about working from home. So it needs to be available to everyone, and I guess going back to what I was talking about before, freelancers don't really get the opportunity to have career breaks, parental leave, job sharing and sabbaticals. It's really difficult and quite complex, as was mentioned before, to persuade producers and so on that flexible working, job sharing can actually work on a budget where you're pretty pressurised, I guess.
Okay, who's this going to benefit?
I think, in response to the government's announcement, I think there should be a right to work flexibly, not just ask for it, and as well as a duty to actually advertise those flexible options from employers. People need to know what options are available before applying for a job or starting a job, and obviously flexible working is a critical part of the toolkit for building inclusive workplaces and I think have corresponding benefits for businesses as well in terms of productivity. And, you know, I think a lot of people, when they think about flexible working, it's not just working from home, it's those changes to hours and job sharing and flexi time, and how we make sure that, I think they do predominantly help women and those with caring responsibilities, you know, but we did some polling last year that showed about 60% of women who had been working from home during the pandemic said that the ability to work from home in particular helped them with their menopause symptoms. But ultimately, I think all workers can benefit from flexible working. So I think the government, in its announcement, next steps need to go further in making it a right and not just an ask. And we support the TUC calls in particular on those business reasons and amending those to make sort of flexible working available at a job application stage, but also for employers to reject the reasons that employers reject the flexible working requests need to be replaced with an objective justification too. I think that then mirrors the language in the Equality Act and means that all roles that deem suitable for flexible working, unless it can actually be shown that the unavailability is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. And I think that does give workers more ability to request flexible working, and employers very clear reasons as to why they need to reject. I think a lot of research has shown that around 30% of flexible working requests were denied, TUC research in 2019. And in particular for our membership, we've seen where flexible working has been used instead of reasonable adjustments for a lot of our members who are disabled. And we've heard of employers seeking to use those requests to accommodate disabled workers working from home instead of actually abiding by those reasonable adjustments, which is another concern. So yeah, I think we know less scrupulous employers may choose deliberately to reject applicants on grounds that they intend to request flexible working. And if there's a breach of an Equality Act, I think that could change the conversation and change that imbalance. So we'd like to see those sort of announcements go further in terms of flexible working, but as well as a wider campaign around who's entitled to flexible working. And sort of as that presents another barrier, and just making sure that awareness is very clear that flexible working can benefit all kinds of workers in different ways, shapes and forms, and how we really, really encourage and make sure that as successful as possible.
Before I come to Keith, I should add, Chair, I have worked with Kate on previous programmes and indeed with Keith Ewing, so I should clarify that for the record. Well, Professor Ewing, do you want to make any comment about the announcements around flexible working?
Just to agree with what's already been said, I think the other point I would make, maybe 2 points. One is that this is an issue, it seems to me it's a big issue which has to be looked at holistically, and there has to be more than simply a right to request flexible working for those who need to do that, in the sense that it does raise questions about the context within which that right is exercised. So it raises questions, I think, about affordable daycare, about at the other end of the spectrum, affordable social care, so that people are actually liberated and able to take part in work if that is their desire. I think there are also questions about people who do have full-time caring responsibilities and who do want to participate in employment, whether it's enough simply to say that they should have a right to request flexible working, or whether we should go further and say that in some cases the employer should have a duty to accommodate the interests or needs or requests of the employee. So I think there are, in a sense, there are a wider range of issues. And the point that was raised this morning, I think, about on the radio by the shadow spokesman for DWP, Jonathan Ashworth, speaking about bringing older workers back into the workforce. Well, how are we going to do that unless we can have some kind of arrangement which will facilitate that? There may well be, of course, that can be done on a voluntary basis, but it may not be enough to do so. We may need to contemplate some kind of legal measure which will attract these people back. But apart from that, what I would say is that while I think it is important to focus on flexibility in its wider aspects, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's an issue of job security. So security is a flip side of flexibility. And at the moment, under our current legal regime, as we've seen over the last few years, there is a lot of flexibility on the employer side, but that flexibility, some people would argue, is not fully reciprocated in terms of the interests of the employee. So there is a balance, I think, that needs to be restruck in terms of the way in which we approach employment.
You touched upon that flexibility, oblique fragility. Leads me into the area of employment status, because it's a vexed area for us. In fact, the government's issued guidance around that very recently. We did hear from Matthew Taylor's successor that she found it particularly difficult to follow it through. Do you think it helped clarify the employment status of workers?
Well, the document, the text which the government put on the website? No, I don't think so. I think one of the problems, what the documents, what the text says, is that if you fall within, there are a number of criteria which are listed, and if you meet most of these, then you're likely to be an employee. Well, that's perhaps misleading in some cases, because you may meet almost all of them, but you may fail to meet one of them. If, for example, you can provide a substitute. It doesn't matter if you meet all the other criteria. The likelihood then is that if you're free to provide a substitute to do your work because you're unavailable, then that is likely to take you into the status of being self-employed or a worker, or self-employed or a worker, or some other status. So the problem, so that's one example, and I think, if you go back to some of the case law, there's a famous case in 1983 where the court simply listed features of the particular employment which were consistent with it being a contract of service, features which were neutral, and features which were inconsistent with it being a contract of service. And the features which were inconsistent were only a minority. And so the fact that you comply with most doesn't matter. If the minority of issues you can't comply with are critical, then it takes you into a different status from that of an employee. And in that case, there was one critical factor which wasn't met by the individual, which meant that the individual in question was to be regarded as self-employed for the purposes of unfair dismissal law. So I think it's too simplistic, the guidance which has been given. It is unhelpful, and it is potentially misleading in certain crucial respects. There are also other issues about this. The question is, why is the government doing this? The job of issuing advice about employment matters is a statutory obligation of ACAS. Now, if there is a need to issue advice on this question, why is ACAS, as an independent agency, not performing this function? And in a sense, the third question really is, what is the legal effect? What is the legal status of this advice? And the answer is it can have none, because in our system, Parliament makes the law. It's not for government to try to influence the way in which the law is developed by issuing unilateral advice in this way. So I think, in terms of the contents and in terms of the process, there are serious questions that need to be addressed.
Okay, would that process be assisted by just simplifying the structure? Is there a case for just having it very clear that people are either genuinely self-employed, or alternatively the control that's exercised by the person that the organisation delivering the service to actually defines them as an employee with attendant rights? Would we be better served with a system such as that?
We've been exploring a statutory definition of self-employment and how that could help clear up the maze that is employment statuses. And, I think when we look to the question of why so many people are in this grey area between employment and self-employment, it clearly has to be brought up to date for those legitimate self-employed people who are choosing it. And a statutory definition of self-employment might be one option to explore. It's not just sole traders, freelancers, partners or subcontractors, but legally those are limited companies and agency or casual workers, fixed term contractors. There's a real grey area between those, and I think I'd agree that the current system, I don't think it's demonstrating to be fit for purpose, guidance or not, and there's clearly a widespread confusion around sort of the alignment of tax and employment statuses that have to be addressed.
Yeah. Philippa, do you want to add from that, perhaps that freelance perspective? Because that's
Yeah. I mean, I certainly agree with what's been said already, and I think our view is that more companies need to undertake proper status determinations rather than forcing their contractors inside IR35 without due consideration. Obviously, the government's announcement and then U-turn caused quite a bit of confusion also. But I think we think a clear set of rules do need to be developed, and an ACAS would be a good vehicle through which to do that, to enable individuals, hirers and HMRC to see whether the appropriate employment tax status is being applied in every case, and a statutory definition of self-employment which includes an agreed upon set of rights and obligations would reduce the problem of misclarification. And we think something which would certainly help is when statements of particulars are issued, which everybody should receive, it should state clearly what the employment status is, whether you're an employee, PAYE, freelancer, or sole trader, or whatever. And this would certainly help, and everyone would have clarity from day one.
Keith, can I come back to that on this representative classification of people, because we've got a confusing picture in terms of the tax regimes opposite employment status. Would we not be better served by simplification and an alignment of those the different classifications?
Well, I think that's a good question. My starting point for this is to say, really, I mean, you can't address the question of status in the abstract, I don't think. You've got to ask, what purpose are you trying to achieve, or what objective are you trying to achieve by changing or amending the law? And my starting point would be to say, well, the purpose of employment law is to ensure that people are protected. And we should be drafting a definition which is as inclusive as possible, so that we catch as many people as possible. People who work for a living should be entitled to be protected by the labour laws which the state provides. And that would be my starting point. There are two private members' bills at the moment, one in the Commons, Chris Stevens, one in the House of Lords, Lord Hendy, which in my view achieve that objective. Now, there are separate questions then about tax. And I think the issues of employment status and tax are different. The policy objectives are different. And there will be borderline cases where we can't determine whether someone is an employee for employment purposes or self-employed or an employee for tax purposes. In my view, we should be prepared to say that in borderline cases, somebody may be an employee for employment law purposes, but may be self-employed for tax purposes. It depends on the objective that you're trying to reach, or the goal you're trying to achieve. So that would be, in a sense, my starting point. Everybody should be in. If there are special rules why people should be treated differently for tax reasons, then do that. Or for national insurance, or for any other purpose.
Yeah, you've done a lot of work on the protections and rights of self-employed people. What's your perspective on a better alignment, or whether you concur with Professor Ewing?
I think we need to have a conversation around a safety net for the self-employed before we divulge into sort of the different tax and statuses, because it's very clear that self-employed workers, need more of a safety net. They need more support in their work. The pandemic and the experience of the self-employed demonstrated that, in our opinion, and sort of the decline in numbers of the self-employed. And a lot of self-employed people enjoy that flexibility, the freedom and control of the work, but would want to have a conversation around a safety net on things like sick pay, for example, and how that then feeds into, I suppose, status and tax and so on. We did an analysis of sort of the self-employed experiences during the pandemic, in particular on the Test and Trace sort of support grants, and 1 in 5 applications came from the self-employed when we did that analysis, and that is an overrepresentative sort of group applying for that grant, and clearly demonstrates the need that the self-employed workforce are looking for more support in the workplace, sort of across the benefit spectrum, but particularly on sick pay, and that's a really, really key issue for our members. And on universal credit in particular, we saw that the self-employed workers, the numbers in claiming universal credit increased by 270% during the pandemic, which is massive. And I think that really shows a picture that we need to explore how we can further support this section of the workforce by providing protections and security and fair and good quality work for them as well. So I think there's a whole conversation to be had around the self-employed section of the workforce and how we make sure that's good quality, well-paid self-employment too.
Olivia, you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to agree largely with what's been said, but also just to say that it might be quite attractive to have a very simplistic view of employment status, but what we saw through the pandemic was either the people, so tens of thousands of our members fell between the gaps of the job retention scheme, which was for employees and people had to be employed within certain dates, and the self-employed income support scheme, because of the basis on which they were engaged. That was the reason that they fell between those gaps. So I agree with Kate that there needs to be much more support for self-employed workers more generally. But I think the pandemic really exposed that lack of support and understanding of the complex nature of the employment market.
And finally, from each, just opposite the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, clearly we've entered into a relationship with the European Union in this new regime. Is there anything coming out of government subsequent to that gives you any cause for concern as to whether we'll continue to align, and what are the potential pitfalls that maybe we may be facing in these particular areas? I don't know, Professor Ewing, do you want to make...
Well, I'm sure you're very familiar with this, having lived through the process. But I mean, in terms of, there's a huge obligation, I think, arising under the agreement. Let me just begin with the first, because it relates directly to the retained EU bill, which is currently in committee, I believe. Now, there are provisions in the free trade agreement. I'll just refer to Article 387, which provides for non-regression of labour standards in 5 specific areas, where these relate to trade and investment. Now, I think this has a huge impact for the removal of these of workers' rights in these 5 areas, as appears to be anticipated in the current bill. And since to do that, I think would be to violate the terms of the agreement. So secondly, then, there are obligations in Article 399 of the agreement, which require us to give several obligations to get effectively to implement various obligations arising under the ILO treaties to which we're a party, and also the European Social Charter of 1961 to which we are a party. Now, that is clearly relevant in terms of what the bill which is about to be announced today, in terms of minimum service levels in the events of industrial action. So the question is, to what extent has the government's proposals been tested against the obligations which arise under the free trade agreement, although they arise in any event. We're already bound by these obligations, but they've been reinforced by the terms of the free trade agreement. Free trade agreement, just to simplify this, we cannot remove basically the EU social rights inheritance because of Article 387, where the removal is motivated by trade and investment, which seems to be the motivation here. And the other thing that we must do under the agreement is effectively to implement, not to derogate from, but effectively to implement our obligations under ILO and the European Social Charter. And the question is, to what extent, and this is something the government will have to be very mindful of, I think, is the extent to which the bill which is yet to be published is compatible with these obligations. So it's just an indication. So it comes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, that in a sense the landscape has changed. We can't return to the halcyon days. Brexit doesn't mean release from international obligations or even from continuing obligation to comply with European law. We can improve upon the Working Time Directive. We can improve upon the agency workers regulations, but we can't remove them. We can replace them in substantively similar terms, but we can't remove them. nor should we be doing things which violate our treaty obligations in terms of the ILO and the European Social Charter.
Obviously, that's very specific and erudite. I don't know whether other colleagues want to make any contribution. Kate?
Not much to add, apart from obviously we share the concerns that erosions of workers' rights will have in the UK. Very concerned.
I agree with that, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks,
Great.
Kate.
Thank you. Mark Palsy, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I've got a couple more questions on self-employment, but I just wanted to ask Professor Ewing, if I could please, that you spoke a bit about the rights to go to flexible working, and you spoke about the balance needing to be restruck. I wonder if I could put the same point to you that I put to the previous panel, which is that, businesses are short of people. We hear it from employer organisations, and we hear about it in our own constituencies. Why do you think there needs to be a legislative change in respect of offering flexibility? Why do you think that existing employers, faced with staff shortages, aren't finding it the obvious and sensible thing to do?
Well, and there is no evidence. No, I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that. I guess what you're saying is that the market should operate, and the market pressure will force employers to, if they want good staff, to.
Why isn't that happening? Is my question.
You tell me. I mean, there is no evidence. I have no evidence or data to.
Why do you think employers are intransigent then? And why?
Well,
do you
the
think
point is,
we're not
let me just say, we're not legislating for the moment. We're legislating for times when the market may not be quite so tight, where there may be. We're looking into a future in which perhaps there may be higher levels of unemployment. So this may be, in a sense, we're operating at the moment at what may be a very narrow window of experience. Things could be different in the future. But in any event, it doesn't address, even if that is the overall picture. And in a sense, employers are happy to offer flexible working arrangements. Why wouldn't you not then want to legislate to ensure that they did? Or to ensure that the employers who were intransigent were required to. So there was still, even though you have a situation in which a majority of employers, for commercial reasons, are bound or feel bound to be more flexible, there will always be those who hold out, who are intransigent.
And right now they would
be. In a sense, what we're dealing with, we're legislating to deal with the antisocial, as is often the case. Right. The people who are making things worse for the employers who are prepared to behave well. Okay, but that is typically the purpose of employment law.
Okay, you'd agree that those employers who are not behaving flexibly, perhaps they are doing themselves a disadvantage right now because they haven't got access to workers that those offering flexible working would do so. I'm trying to ask your view as to why they would not do that.
I have no idea why they wouldn't do it. It would be irrational not to do it. But the fact is that not all employers are rational, kind, generous, well-intentioned people. And to deal with the people, those employers who don't behave in that way,
so your premise would be that we need to assume that everybody behaves in the worst possible way and create our legislation to deal with that.
No, that's exactly not what I'm saying. Precisely not what I'm saying. I'm saying because there are some who will. I'm accepting your premise that many will behave. But I'm offering you...
Their interest.
It may well be, of course. But there will be people who don't. And it may not be in their interest to behave in that way, but there will be victims of their bad behaviour who need the support of the law.
Okay. Let's move on to self-employed. Kay, you said that self-employed workers need more support, they miss out on support, they don't have a safety net, so you're presumably pretty happy with the report from Prospect that there are around 800,000 fewer self-employed people in the workforce than there were pre-pandemic.
It's true that those numbers have declined, but perhaps...
Is it a good thing?
No, I don't think it's something that we should be championing when people move out of work, but obviously we don't know the circumstances where those self-employed workers have moved to, but I don't think it's at the extent as to what we thought it was, that the Labour Force survey, it was a joint research report, I should say as well, with Prospect and Community Trade Union, an inquiry into the future of self-employment, sort of analysing the experiences of the self-employed and freelance workforce during the pandemic. But just to go back to the figures, it's perhaps not as as significant as we thought from the labour force survey, and there's those estimations of those 700,000 individuals to 4.3 million. The employment data from the 2021 census shows that overall number of operating self-employed is actually closer to 4.7 million, but still obviously it's a decline in figures, and
that's 700,000 fewer workers who are subject to the disadvantages of being self-employed. That's a good thing, surely.
I think a lot of people, and our members in particular, they enjoy this way of working, they enjoy the flexibility, freedom and control that self-employment brings. They love what they do, and I think that's what's brilliant about self-employment. However, a lot of our members are on the lower paid spectrum of self-employment, and, you know, unfortunately, it does sometimes mean less security, more hours and less pay, and more worry about finances for those workers. And we want to have a conversation about how we make all work good quality.
If these people are less well paid and got no protections, they'd presumably be better off being employed.
Not necessarily. It's about how we can make self-employment as meaningful and good quality and successful as we can within the labour market, because those workers and our members choose that way of working. They enjoy the benefits and the positivity that self-employment brings, but they want to see more support in a safety net and security when times do get tough, and when they are struggling, as many did throughout the pandemic, as I alluded to in those figures, as an argument for looking at sick pay, but also on things around stronger maternity support for the self-employed. Adequate parental leave is absolutely vital and critical for every
They get
worker.
all of those things if they're employed. So why isn't switching from self-employment to employed status a good thing?
It might be a good thing to some people in their circumstances. That's what they might choose to do if self-employment isn't for them, and the positives that self-employment bring might not outweigh the potential negatives for some workers. But I don't think that the answer and the solution is to moving everybody into an employed status just for those benefits. I think we have to acknowledge and embrace self-employment, the benefits that it brings to our economy and the local communities, and make sure that it's good quality and meaningful ones. And things like sick pay and stronger maternity allowance, increasing that to bring it in line with SMP, and looking at things like shared parental leave and the keep in touch days, and these relatively small policy issues that we can really help a wide section of the workforce to keep them in that way of working, because that's what they enjoy doing, and they bring a lot of benefits to our economy and creativity and so on and so forth, that I'm sure Philippa will touch on from her members.
Yeah, Philippa, I'm a bit confused. I'm not sure whether this decline in the number of people who are self-employed is a good thing or a bad thing or of no consequence at all. In which case, why did you draw attention to it?
I think there has been a decline in some areas, as I said earlier, in the creative industries less so, where there's actually more of a reliance upon self-employed, and that's due to the very nature of the industry. And I think it would be very difficult to turn the tens of thousands of freelancers who work in film and TV into employees. So likewise, our members enjoy the freelance nature of the work that they are doing. They do argue, and we argue on their behalf and campaign on their behalf for more of a safety net for them, more of a framework within which they can.
If the safety net framework arises through employment, why don't you argue for them to become employees of the organisation that's paying them to do the work?
Because it simply wouldn't work on the basis of the project nature of film and TV production. And the move has been very much towards the freelance model over the years.
And is that because it suits the workers just as much as it suits the employers?
To a certain extent, our members do enjoy, yes, working on one production and then being able to go and work for Netflix or whoever. So yes, they do enjoy the variety that goes with it, but there are downsides which are about, family life and flexibility and long hours and all of those sorts of things, planning for their future lives and so on, that I think we could put in place some safety net that doesn't involve them becoming employees.
Don't those workers weigh up the advantages and disadvantages in the choice of the career that they choose to pursue?
They do, but unfortunately, there is a propensity within film and TV that women leave the workforce when they have families because they just can't cope with that model and the long hours that are expected of them. There's a shortage in the workforce, so really we should be looking to bring people back into the workforce and bring skills back into the industry, I think, if we want the UK film and TV industry to be as successful as and more successful than it's been up to this point. So I think there are things, even within a freelance environment, that can be put in place which support family life and work-life balance better than the model we currently have.
Thank you. I should have said earlier that we had invited Deliveroo to come and give evidence today, because I did want the voice of an employer to give evidence. And whilst they'd agreed initially, at the last minute, suddenly they were unavailable and nobody at all at Deliveroo was available to give evidence. And I just wonder why that might be. I mean, there's been a bit of case law in the last couple of years with Uber. Organisations like Deliveroo have tried to, I think about benefits of that type of model of work. Are they running away from giving evidence because there are still major problems with that model of employment, or where they've got to in terms of their self-defined benefits package, has that kind of improved the situation? I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that.
Well, could I just say that I can understand why Deliveroo would want to come, because there is a Supreme Court case pending to which they are a party on the question of employment status.
Right.
And whether Deliveroo riders, I think, are employees or workers for the purposes of the trade union recognition legislation. So I guess if I was them, I wouldn't come, because in a sense, in case something was said which might be unhelpful.
They didn't give that as the reason, unfortunately, but it sounds like that would be a pragmatic...
That would be a plausible reason. I mean, it's not for me to speak for Deliveroo, but it might be a plausible reason for not coming.
Kate or Philippa, I mean, from your experience, has working in those types of organisations improved sufficiently in the last couple of years, or is there more to do?
I think there's always more to do. I think we've seen quite innovative ways in making work fairer with the G&Bs in particular, working with Deliveroo and Uber, and I think that will be really interesting to see how those partnerships play out and how we can ensure that those models do succeed in the best interests of working people and distributing that power more to those riders and those who work for Uber. So I think it'll be really interesting and really innovative for the trade union movement to explore partnerships perhaps with people that we traditionally might not have worked with in the past, but that is absolutely the way that work is going for a lot of people. And I think it's really important that unions in particular are in the room and speaking with a lot of these companies and sort of increase platform-based work. So yeah, I think it's really exciting that we've seen those partnerships and deals. I think there's a hell of a lot to do. And as we've mentioned before, I don't think the employment status determined by the courts is particularly helpful for these companies. Obviously, I can't speak on behalf of them, but I do think there's a concern for a lot of companies and to the extent of what they can actually deliver for workers at the moment. For example, if they do put perhaps providing training for self-employed workers without additional support, and maybe those companies themselves provide a safety net, if they could end up in the courts about that. So I think it feeds into the wider picture of the sort of grey area and the maze of employment status. But I think there's interesting developments that we should watch closely.
Yeah, Andy.
Oh, thanks, Chair. I just wanted to come back on this self-employment status issue, because isn't the nub of the problem that people are being offered gainful employment, or it's being the only gainful employment that's available to them is through a bogus self-employment structure. There's nothing self-employed about it. The total control of the working day is in the hands of the company. Isn't that something that we should be giving great attention to? Yes, to that freedom for people to explore genuine self-employment, but when it's dressed up as self-employment when it clearly isn't, that cannot be helpful, can it, to a better working out of these relationships? Okay.
Yeah, shall I go for it? No, I agree. And where there are those murky lines, I think a worker definition or looking at a statutory definition for self-employment, you would hope would clear up certain issues and prevent bogus self-employment for occurring far too much in different sectors. I think we've touched on IR35 and sort of the how it's unintentionally made it harder and not easier to define contracting and freelancing in particular, but where we can obviously clamp down on bogus self-employment, where people are being perhaps navigated into employment status and not having the benefits and the rights that they should be entitled to, absolutely has to be prevented, and we have to make sure that workers are in the right status as suits them and as feasible as possible. But yeah, where we see bogus self-employment, we absolutely have to make sure that those workers are supported, and that doesn't take place in more sectors that we do see it happening.
Can I just come back on the Chair's points on the Deliveroo issue? I mean, I'm sure this isn't the reason why they didn't come, but I do think the issue is not resolved, in the sense the fact that we've got a case in the Supreme Court as to whether Deliveroo riders are workers or not for the purposes of trade union recognition legislation is itself a problem, isn't it? In the sense it reveals that the problem continues, in the sense that they can't even, at the moment, get a recognition agreement or engage in collective bargaining with the employer because of the way in which the law is currently structured. There is also the question, if they are, and it relates also to Uber and other companies, if they are deemed to be employees or workers, the question is what they get paid for. And it's not just a question of status, it's also a question of what counts as working time for the purposes of payment. And that is a big problem, which is also exposed by a recent Supreme Court case, which I think needs fully to be addressed. When I go to work for my employer, am I entitled to be paid for the whole period I am engaged by the employer? Or am I entitled only to be paid for the short periods of work in which I'm actively engaged in work for that employer? And that is a huge abuse which needs to be addressed.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that Supreme Court case. My last question before we finish today is around the right to disconnect, which I know some European countries have put into law. Has there been any evidence yet about whether it's been effective or not, and whether we ought to consider that in the UK?
Well, I mean, I get lots of students who write papers on dissertations of various kinds on the right to disconnect in various countries. They're all very interesting, and I think I would support something like that here. And it's something which is growing in popularity. And I can see no reason why we don't have that here. In a sense, it goes back to it's the flip side of the points I made earlier. Why should I be expected to be on call to my employer when it's a period for which I'm not being paid? I mean, it just seems to me a no-brainer.
Do you both agree?
Yeah, I think the more we can protect the boundaries between life and work, the better. And sort of, I think with the right to disconnect, it of course would have to be managed quite flexibly and depending on workers' preferences, but should allow a time where workers can expect not to have to respond to emails, phone calls or other contact for their employer in out of contracted hours and protected from demands to work. And I think alongside that, we have to ensure that those good working practices do keep in line with that increased flexibility that we've touched on during this session, and ensuring it is genuinely flexible and that workers do benefit from the opportunity that new technology does bring.
Yeah, absolutely, and I agree as well. We've done quite a lot of work on the right to disconnect at Prospect, and we very much think that legislation would help. It wouldn't necessarily solve the whole problem, but it would help employees manage the relationship with the employer and put boundaries into the working day. So yes, absolutely, we agree.
Okay, well, that's us done for today. So thank you to all three of you for your evidence. We're very grateful to you.